let them jump on. We're excited to have Dr. Tim Clarey with us today. He's from the Institute for Creation Research up in the Dallas, Fort Worth area. And many of you guys got to go with us on that trip back in October, and you saw the museum there. I know we enjoyed that day. And so I know he's going to talk a little bit about some of the things there. I don't know how in his presentation, how some of the pictures you might remember from that. But just to tell you a little bit about Dr. Clarey, he has a Master's of Science in Geology from the University of Wyoming. He has a Master's of Science in Hydrogeology from Western Michigan University. I had to learn how to say that before we got on here. He's got a PhD in geology from Western Michigan University, and has quite a few distinctions. He's been a professor in a number of areas. He was in the professor in geosciences chair at Delta College in Michigan for 17 years, and has been with ICR since 2013. And I know Ms. Kim has a few of his books, and I know he'll talk a little bit more about them, but y'all have probably seen this one in her classroom, Dinosaurs. You know, you got it right there sitting next to, what's Tiny? Y'all know Tiny the dinosaur. It's in Miss Kim's class, yeah. She's got this book. This is a book that he wrote. And then a newest book that he's going to talk more about today and that we're going to learn is this one right here that he wrote. And I know he's going to talk more about this later, but we've got a few of his books if you guys have an interest in looking in those. We're excited to have him. So at this time, I'm going to mute myself, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Clarey. And thank you, sir, for being here with us today.
Oh, you're most welcome. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to do these presentations to the students, because you guys are our future, scientists, and whether you go into science or not, it's good to know kind of what science is good and what's not. And what I tried to do in this talk and in my book that just came out, the kind of reddish colored one, is I tried to follow data. I collected a lot of data. One thing your instructor didn't tell you was I did work for about 8 years with Chevron Oil Company looking for oil. And those are some of the skills I used that I learned with oil companies to do this. And so I think God brought me to ICR, with the skill package that I had. He kind of, over the 20, 30 some years now being a geologist, I now understand a lot more things on a kind of a bigger scale. And I got a chance to work a lot of the country, and now I see the same geology is the same sort of things happening everywhere in the world. It's all about the same. And that's, to me, that shows us a global flood. You'll see that the data really does support that. I don't want to talk about the truth of the flood. A lot of people doubt the flood. People wonder, was the flood real? Was it just a local flood? What really happened? We believe at ICR, and I believe the data supports that it was a true global flood, that the whole world flooded. And in the course of the flood, of course, I believe God used different mechanisms to bring on the flood, because one of the most important things that most of my college students don't understand is they don't understand, they think the flood lasted 40 days. But the flood lasted almost a year. And they were on the ark over a year before they got off the ark. So the flood was a real thing, that was a global flood. It took 150 days to rise to the highest level, and then another over 150 days to go down. And so you'll see there's a long, long flood. But a lot of people, they don't believe in a flood for a lot of reasons. And secular science, kind of what's talking about here, the people who don't believe in God, or agnostics or atheists, that's where a lot of the high-powered scientist think tanks come from. And they kind of follow with what Peter wrote here. God told Peter to write this way back when, 2,000 years ago almost now. He said, there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust. So people that have their own ideas, they scoff at the idea the Bible is true. They scoff that there was a flood. And he goes on to say that for this they are willingly ignorant, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, the earth staying out of water, in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So here we have the New Testament. They talk about the flood, a global flood. The whole world perished, not just the Middle East, not just the local area. If it was just a local flood, then the birds could have just flown somewhere else. If it was a local flood, Noah could have migrated somewhere else. Just like, Christ had to do with his family when he was a little child. They had to move to Egypt for a while to get away from King Herod. But the flood was global. There was nowhere to go. And we'll see the rocks really do support that. Evolutionists, unfortunately, and many teachers, well-meaning teachers, people and even Christians, they get to the point where they don't believe in the global flood. And so there's a lot of Christian colleges that don't teach a global flood. They don't teach what the Bible says. We think clearly in the book of Genesis that there's no sort of evolution. Everything reproduces after their kind. And that's what we hold to at ICR, is what really what the Bible says is true. And we confirm the Bible with our research. But you know, God says in Psalm 119 that word is true from the beginning. So it's from the very beginning, from the very first verse. Those are not just stories in the book of Genesis. Those are historic, accurate accounts from God, who was there at the creation. He was there during the flood, and he told Moses ultimately to write these things down. So we're going to look at today 3 truths of the flood, some of which you might have heard before, but I want to spend most of the time on the first one, which is the flood is global, and that's what my research really shows. As I gather data all over the world, I see again and again that the same sort of things were happening on every continent at about the same time. And what was a catastrophic flood as well? A lot of people say it was a tranquil flood. It just kind of slowly came up like your bathtub water. But that's not true at all. There's lots of evidence of real catastrophic movement. Tsunami-like waves washing across major portions of the whole continent, ultimately the whole world. And you got to remember, early in the flood, there were no big mountains. We didn't have most of the mountain ranges we have today. Most of those mountain ranges popped up at the end. And so we'll get into that here in just a minute when we get to the rock cycle of that. But most of what we see, we didn't have to have the water go 26,000 feet high to cover Mount Everest. The pre-flood world might have only had 4,000 or 5,000 foot high elevations. And there's plenty of water to cover that. So it's catastrophic. And third, I want to talk about was a recent flood. The Bible talks about, if you do the genealogies in the Bible, you'll see the earth is only around 6,000 years old. And we believe that's what the data really supports. And there's rock data out there we'll talk about that shows the earth is young. So the secular world actually believes in floods. They see the evidence of floods. Many times people ask me, where's the evidence of the flood? And I just say, look down. There's thousands of feet of sediment below your feet at most locations in the world. Some places there aren't any, but in most places there are. And so the secular world sees this data and they realize there were some floods, and this was the first flood that's supposed to take place in the Cambrian Ordovician, second flood, third flood, fourth flood, fifth flood, and finally the sixth flood. And these are what we call mega sequences, or they used to just be called sequences, but since there's so many terms now, they jump to the term of mega sequence. These are the big flood events. But they believe these took place over millions of years, and this is kind of their time scale. If you look at the second column in from the left, I don't know if you can see this one or not, I'll see my arrow. That's supposed to be the sea level. And these numbers on the side, I think you can see them unless your pictures are in the way, 1 through 6. You have the bottom down there, in the bottom right, it says Sauk. Tippecanoe, and work your way up Kaskaskia, Absaroka, Zuni, and Tejas. So most of you from Texas know about the Tejas. Those are tribes of Native Americans that lived in different parts of the country. And so the guy that named these in the 60s, Lawrence Sloss, wanted to use names that were different than what we've been using for the Cambrian Ordovician, Florida, those names. And so those are mostly European names. And so he decided to use North American names where he first identified these sequences. But these are sequences that are global. We see the sea level rose and drop, rose and drop, rose and drop. But it didn't do quite what they show here, as we'll see later. There was really only one big rise. He didn't start out at the bottom. It shows a real good rise in the Sauk-Kaskaskia Megasequences. The rock data doesn't support that at all. So we're going to look at these as almost chapters of the flood, each flood event. Each flood got higher and higher and higher, as we'll see, until eventually there was a high point where it went over the top, and then it went down. So we're going to look at data. What I started with is looking at data, looking at rock data, looking at oil well data, looking at cores. I assume the Bible is true. And then I looked at what do the rocks show? What do the rocks really show? And so I started plotting up columns. So if you were to drill a well right where you're sitting right now, all the way down to the crust, how many thousands of feet of sediment would you go through? How many thousands of feet or hundreds of feet of sandstone, limestone, shale? And I record all those into a computer database. I put them on a computer, and then we plot them up based on 16 different rock types. We can kind of work through the thing. This is an example from the Michigan Basin, my home state. Some of you think I talk funny, but I talk like I'm from Michigan, because that's where I'm from. But apologize for that. Anyway, the mega sequences are over here. You can see on the chart. I even include a pre-Cambrian one before the Sauk, the earliest sequence. So you can think of the Sauk as like the Cambrian. Eventually you get up to the Absaroka and Zuni, you're looking at the times of the dinosaurs being buried in the flood. And so we'll get to some of those as we go through. But I keep track of the rocks and the rock types. And And again, all the rock layers down below, and the computer kind of ties them all together and makes these big computer models, three-dimensional models of it. But let's start with what the Bible says about the flood. The very first thing that happens in the Bible is God shuts the door. All the animals he brought to the ark, 2 of every kind, including the dinosaurs. I think there's only about 60 kinds of dinosaurs. So you only need about 120 dinosaur pairs. And if you brought juveniles, of course, you would need huge dinosaurs anyway. So the biggest ones were probably left behind. That's why they became the fossils that we see. But there were definitely dinosaurs on the ark because God created them, and he says 2 of every kind, even the beasts of the field, as he talks about. There was no word dinosaur in the Bible. You won't find it in your Bible anywhere because that word wasn't invented until after they translated the Bible into English. So we do see stuff that, like behemoth and leviathan, which they didn't know how to translate. To me, those are probably dinosaurs, but well, that's another talk. So how the flood begins is the fountains of the deep burst on day 1. And so suddenly, and it says Genesis 7:10-11, in the 600th year of Noah's life. And the reason those years are there is so you know the length of the flood. You can total it all up from when it starts to when it ends. But this is a real historic event. He says, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, the windows of heaven open. I think this is when the plates began to break apart. So prior to the flood, there might not have been any plate tectonic activity. That's still a big question in the secular world. You know, how did plate tectonics begin? When did it begin? They have no idea. That's what they call the holy grail of geology. But I believe it started right here by God tells us. And there's no other planet in our solar system that has tectonic plates, just Earth. So Earth is unique in that regard as well. And I think this is when they began. And this, you know, when the fountains burst, made all these ridges in the oceans, where you started moving seafloor spreading rapidly, like John Baumgartner has shown, you'd get runaway subduction. But I don't think initially there was a lot of movement. There was some limited locations moving, so you didn't get a lot of flooding. The more ocean crust you make, the more it's going to push up the seafloor from below, just like the bottom of your bathtub, and that's going to push the water higher. So these tsunami-like waves are being generated by rapid plate movement of meters per second, you know, maybe 2 meters per second. Not this much per year, not just a few centimeters per year like we see today. So this really high-density ocean crust was being destroyed. It started being destroyed. Once you start to move the plates, you open up these cracks all over, and then the high-density material at the surface starts to sink almost like a weight in the water. So the plates start to move, and here's today's plates where they've kind of stopped because there's no longer that high-density material in the pre-flood world that still needs to be consumed. But you see all these little volcanoes are shown all over in yellow, and those are also where we see most of the world's earthquakes. It's called the Ring of Fire on the Pacific, but there's other locations in, you know, southern Europe, across Turkey, and even in China and India where there's still a big collision going on. But these are the volcanoes. And so these volcanoes are very, very important. And so plate tectonics, to me, started the rock cycle. Prior to that, there's probably very little rock cycle other than some erosion from just, you know, water carrying things away and dissolving things. But we don't quite understand the pre-flood hydrologic cycle, but there probably wasn't a lot of rock cycle going on. So you weren't really getting rocks being formed until the plates started to move around. And the plates generated lots of energy at the plate boundaries, just like we see today, but even more so. And so volcanic activity was much more intense late in the flood, different times of the flood. So we had all these activities going on. So if you keep track of your 3 basic rock types, I know there's a lot on this screen, just keep track of igneous rocks. Igneous are rocks that form from molten material. So they either came out of the mantle, making a new ocean crust, or it came out of volcanoes, like we see at Mount St. Helens from magma chambers from subduction, or even like at Hawaii. Those are all igneous. Sedimentary rocks form, and there might have been sedimentary rocks forming in the pre-flood, like in rivers, drain into the ocean, because we do know there were rivers. So you probably had sedimentary rocks forming to some respects from weathering and breaking down other rocks. And then there's metamorphic rocks, which I don't know if there were many metamorphic rocks in the pre-flood world or not. There's a lot of heat generated by the flood and a lot of igneous activity. It almost appears the bottom of the crust was almost melting from below. And so there might have been this period of rapid radioactive decay. And most of the radioactive elements collect below the crust even today. And so that area might have gotten really hot. And we see all over the world when I go to Canada, when I used to go to Canada on field trips, I'd see these pink injected magmas all over. You go to the bottom of Grand Canyon, you see these pink injected magmas all over. There's a tremendous amount of heat going on during the flood and during this plate motion that was taking place. So you had a lot of opportunities for igneous magmas to form, the ocean crust formed new from igneous material. And metamorphism was taking place with all these mountains happening, again, mostly later in the flood. But tremendous erosion was taking place. John Baumgartner's worked on that, how much erosion can take place just with moving water. You can generate thousands and thousands of feet of sediment rapidly by just moving water. And so all these materials, I think most of what we see in the rock cycle actually occurs in the flood and did occur in the flood. And again, keep in mind, unlike a biological life cycle, there's no beginning to a rock cycle. You can start with anything. You can take original material, and people always talk about magma first, because the secondary model is the earth cooled from a melt. But God created the continents, God created the ocean crust, God created the original ocean was already there. And then when it moved around, of course, then there was a lot of activity taking place, a lot more erosion, a lot of metamorphism, and a lot more magmas and lavas that poured out during the flood. So as you move around, you can cook a rock to a point of not quite melting it, and that's going to be metamorphism. You can squeeze it and not quite melt it, that's metamorphism. If you melt it, push it too far, of course, and it melts again, that's an igneous rock. So there are some igneous rocks that form from even previous igneous rocks, they just remelt in the right locations. Sedimentary rocks, we see thousands and thousands of feet of sedimentary rock probably formed much during the flood from just the erosive activity of water. And so you can move around the rock cycle from place to place, but the best way to do is keeping track of what these rocks mean. I'll go back. If you keep track of igneous, thermal melt, sedimentary, some weathering and erosion, metamorphism is the heat and pressure changing the rocks, changing the minerals, even those rocks, because of the conditions they're in. But most of that, I believe, took place not only at plate boundaries, but most of it probably took place during the flood. And there's not a lot going on today, and that's why scientists look at the world and they go, well, it looks really old, because they don't see these activities taking place like they did during the flood. They forget that there was a flood. They forget there was this big event, bigger than we can imagine, that affected the entire world, and I think even the crust itself of the earth. So I'll move back to the flood. That was a little deviation on the rock cycle your instructors requested. So hopefully that made some sense. All right, moving on. Let's look at after the fountains burst and the plate started to move. What really happened was the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And a lot of people stop there and say, oh, that's it. But we'll see there was more to that. But I believe this was the early part of the flood, maybe chapters 1 to 3 of those first 3 sequences. And I suggest it might be up to day 40, as we'll see why a little bit later. So that's, I believe, is the Sauk-Kaskaskia, the typical Sauk-Kaskaskia sequences. So the rocks like the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, maybe even up through about the Mississippian level, were being deposited around the world at this time. And we'll see there's a lot of similarities, same rock types, same fossils being buried at the same time, but almost all these fossils at the time were just marine fossils, shallow marine fossils exclusively. Very few land animals or plants formed at all. And it's because the flood was beginning, and there were these tsunami waves. As the place started to move, you start generating tsunami waves. Because you got to think of tsunami waves probably 300, 400, maybe even 500 feet high. And so many being generated so rapidly, John Baumgartner suggested that you would add standing waves of water that couldn't even drain off before the next one came on, before the next one came on, before the next one came on. So the water would keep building and building. And as you made more ocean crust, as the flood progressed, you pushed the water levels up even higher. So the tsunami waves reached even farther and farther inland, and eventually everything succumbed. But to me, one of the telling tales, the first signs of the flood sediments coming across the continent is in North America. There's my little dots on there, my data points. And you see that yellow area is all one sandstone. That is known as the Sauk sand, or the Tapeats equivalent. In Grand Canyon, it's called the Tapeats sandstone at the bottom. And it's on the Great Unconformity. But this whole area, it was all, mostly below this is igneous and metamorphic rocks. Rocks that might have cooked early in the flood during the fountains bursting, and then suddenly the waves start coming in. And this is known as a blanket sand, or a sheet sand. It's very difficult for secular scientists to explain the sand. It's continuous, and yet in most places it's only 20, 30, 40 feet thick, even thinner in places, especially down the middle of the country. It was very thin. So areas of white means there's no sediment there from this sequence. So this is what's left. There's been a lot of erosion from subsequent sequences. There's been a lot of erosion since the flood. So there's no sediment up in Canada to speak of from this level. It's all white. But you can see the same sandstone is in my home state of Michigan, is in Texas, is in Arizona, Montana, even up in Canada, and up in Greenland. And so you can go to the pictured rocks in Michigan over there on the left side, looking at Lake Superior, you see the same sandstone is in the bottom of Grand Canyon. Same equivalent sandstone. And this sandstone is even global. You can see the same sandstone, part of the same sandstone is found in Petra, Jordan, where they built those cities, whole buildings in the sandstone. That sandstone is from this earliest flooding of the sediments. But if you look at the Sauk-Kaskaskia, as I mentioned, you see almost all exclusively marine life, shallow marine critters. They were caught up in these early waves. So all you were flooding early, I believe, is just the shallow seas that might have been on the continents. And a lot of North America apparently was a shallow sea. Other continents, there's very little coverage, as we'll see later, early in the flood. So now we move to day 40, I think. So as a question mark, to day 150. And I believe it's day 40 at this point, because now you start to see land animals and land plants suddenly show up. And the reason I say that is in this passage in the Bible. Genesis 7, 17 and 19 says, and the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and buried up the ark. So now we have the ark floating. And on day 40 or day 41, right after day 40. So now we're starting to flood the land, because I assume Noah didn't build the ark out in the water. And so the land is now being flooded. So that's why I use that day 40 as the key day of when you're flooding just shallow seas to now you're flooding land. And the Bible goes on and says, the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth. The waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. It goes on to talk about this was day 150. Appears to be when everything was flooded. But the Bible's telling us in yellow, the waters increased, the waters prevailed, the waters increased greatly, the waters prevailed exceedingly. God is telling us the water got higher and higher and higher. So we should see that in the rocks. If we look at the Absaroka sequence, which I believe is day 40 to maybe day 90 of the flood, we do see that. That's when you see the first, the ark starts to flow, but we see sediments coming in now from a different direction. You're now subducting the west coast of North America, and along the Pacific Ocean starts to form, whole new ocean starts to form anew. And this is the oldest ocean crust we have today, only goes back to this sequence. So the ocean crust is much, much younger than the continents. And it's because it turned over during the flood through that runaway subduction. But this is as old as it gets. So there was a tremendous amount of ocean crust being formed at this point, and more ocean crust means you push the water up higher. So we now see over 3 kilometers, 2 miles or so, of sediment coming in from the southwest across most of the American West. Tremendous amount of flooding that took place that we didn't even see before in the West. And the whole new ocean crust, as I mentioned, turned over. This is the age of the ocean crust, of course, in secular millions of years. But in the relative sense, the red areas are the youngest, the green areas are older, and the blue is the oldest. And you can kind of see when the continents broke apart at different times. North America and Africa split apart earlier because there's some blue there on the coastlines. And then as you go south, South America, it's all green between South America and Africa. So that broke apart a little bit later. And so you can see when the continents were splitting around and moving during the course of the flood. But the reason for that is God used the creation of new seafloor to push the water up higher and higher and higher and flood the earth. So there was a splitting of the continents that took place. Some of this took place later in the flood, some took place earlier. There was a very rapid movement going on in the flood, and that pushed up the water high enough. Now you're flooding plants that lived on land. So you see these big, extensive coal seams all forming up in the Absaroka sequence as well after day 40. And land animals start to get buried and get mixed in with the marine animals. Then you go to the Zuni sequence, which I believe is the high point of the flood, and we'll talk about that a little bit why later. But you can see here's the similar coverage areas in green, or 3 kilometers or deeper. It's about 2 miles or deeper. And you can see across Canada a couple of blue dots. Even across Michigan and Illinois, you see a couple of blue dots. To me, those are very, very significant. They're found up in Canada in Wells and Hudson Bay. Shows that these rocks were deposited somehow from somewhere else. They don't just drop sediment off in the middle of nowhere. This sediment had to be transported in. So there apparently was a lot more sediment up across Canada during the flood, and there's just remnants of it left. So I kind of look at this as a bathtub ring. When you get really dirty, some of you remember that when you were a young kid, jumped to the bathtub and got out, and there was a big dirty bathtub ring around it. So all the dirt it washed off you. Oh, maybe some of you from the city, you don't know. But when I grew up on a farm, we got really dirty and dusty playing around in the barn. And so there'll be a little bathtub ring around. Well, this is the bathtub ring of the high point of the flood. So the water went all the way across, I believe, during the Zuni. And this is verified. If you look at the statistics, you'll see my numbers. Everything reaches a maximum. The maximum surface coverage globally, The maximum thickness globally all happens here in the Zuni, which is about the end of the Cretaceous. So it appears when the dinosaurs got wiped out that weren't on the ark, we see them disappear in the rock record at the Cretaceous level. That's kind of the high point of the flood. And it went all the way across. Now you might say, well, why is it white now? Why is there no rock there, hardly except those little remnants? The Bible goes on to say that the water only rose 15 cubits over the highest hills, which is about 22 feet. So if you're only going 22 feet, but you get these waves moving 30, 40, 50 miles an hour like tsunami waves do across the land, you're going to rip everything off, you erode it down, but you're not going to leave a lot of sediment behind. You can't leave thousands of feet of sediment with 20 or so feet of water. There's a little bit of sediment spread across here. But that's why the secular scientists don't believe it ever flooded everything. They don't read the Bible and realize these sediments were very thin. But they also can't explain how those little remnants got out there. So if you look at the animals in the Absaroka and Zuni, you see marine animals mixed with land animals. We see sharks mixed with T-Rexes. They actually found a shark right at the same spot they pulled a Tyrannosaurus Rex too. There's 6 species of sharks found in the same rock layers that we find Tyrannosaurus Rex out in Montana. So there's all this land and marine mixing. I see this globally. I see this in India. I see it in South America. I see land and marine mixed. That's just a common phenomenon, which you'd expect in the global flood. Secular scientists have a tough time explaining why there are marine fossils mixed in with land animals. But in the floods, it's makes a lot more sense. So here's kind of a summary. We looked at the paleobiology database, which is a secular database of all the occurrences of fossils. And we plotted up land and marine. When you see the first 3 sequences, Sauk-Kaskaskia, are almost all blue. They're almost 100% marine fossils because you're only flooding marine areas. And then as you go to the Carboniferous, which includes the Pennsylvanian, which is the Absaroka and up, you see more and more red showing up. Always though a lot of blue, a lot of marine mixed as well. But you see more and more land animals showing up because you're flooding more and more land environments as the water went higher. So during the Absaroka, we see land and marine, mostly swampy areas. The Zuni, we see land and marine. Most of the dinosaurs are wiped out at this point. They weren't on the ark. And you might wonder, how did the dinosaurs survive early? Why didn't they get buried early? Why is it just marine fossils? Well, the dinosaurs probably swam and walked along, tried to stay above the water as best they could. They even had to lay eggs. They had to, so we find egg nests because the dinosaurs probably didn't get wiped out until maybe day 90 or day 120 of the flood. And so there was a lot of time for them to leave footprints. And where we find most of the dinosaurs in North America is an area in yellow here, which I call Dinosaur Peninsula. And this comes right from my data set. We pushed a button, so it gives us the 500 meter line, 500 meters of thickness. And that basically became the boundaries. Where we believe is in blue was the shallow sea in the pre-flood world in the east and west, including Arizona and parts of Texas. And then the yellow areas are where those rock layers, early rock layers, are very thin. And so we believe they weren't being flooded early. That's where the dinosaurs were living. They were flooded next. These are the Absaroka and Zuni sequences. And then up in Canada, where it's all green, was probably the pre-flood uplands, where probably humans were living, and more common mammals like lions and tigers and bears. I know what you're saying right now. Lions, tigers, bears, camels, horses, cattle, sheep, and all that stuff that humans would have herded in the pre-flood world probably were all up in the uplands. And there's different uplands on different continents, as we'll see. But in North America, it seems to be Canada was probably the high ground. And there's this peninsula of land that was swampy where the dinosaurs were living. So when you find fossils in my home state of Michigan, we find mostly marine critters. When you go to Colorado and Wyoming, we find dinosaurs mixed with the marine critters. And if we would have found fossils, if they weren't all stripped off, except for those couple of remnants, we'd have probably found more mammals and human fossils up in Canada. But those were all washed off and spread all over the place on top of the dinosaurs across North America and even washed offshore. So here's kind of a ecological zonation, we call it. The green areas would have been, or the brown areas would have been flooded first. That's the shallow marine areas of the continents in the pre-flood world, and the water went higher as you made more ocean crust. You flooded the dinosaur peninsula areas where the dinosaurs are living in the lowlands, and then finally the upland areas were flooded last as the water progressed. But again, you got to think this was a slow judgment. 150 days before every land animal that wasn't on the ark was dead or drowned. So if you were a human, you could see it coming month after month after month. And yet there was nowhere to go, ultimately, as we'll see. Eventually, the water went over the top. So it's a very, very slow, painful judgment for the wickedness, the sin of Adam and Eve, but ultimately the wickedness of humans and the violence of the earth. The dinosaurs were killing each other and violent. So the animals also became violent and wicked. So God decided, I'm going to kind of start over. And the people that believed Noah were saved. They got on the ark. The door was salvation. All you had to do was walk through that door. All you do is believe there was going to be a flood, but nobody could believe it. Nobody believed Noah except his 3 sons and their wives and Noah's wife. So 8 people out of maybe 1 billion people on the earth at the time, only 8 people believed that God was going to send this flood. And today, Jesus is that open door of salvation. He died on the cross for us. God himself came, took on the form of a human, and allowed himself to be slain as the perfect sacrifice, the perfect lamb, unblemished lamb, and died on the cross. That horrific death they talk about, and how awful and painful it was to die that way. Just because he loved us enough to open up that door of salvation again. So all we have to do is believe, and we are saved. So the ark, in some ways, is like the early version of Christ. He had to walk through the door of salvation. They had to believe and know if there's going to be a flood. Today we get eternal salvation through that shed blood of Christ. We get to walk through the door of salvation by just belief. So there's a little bit of an analogy there to the ark in Christ. Hopefully you guys have walked through that door to salvation. So we'll find in chapter 6, the water went down. God finally remembered Noah, and there was a receding phase. It appears from the Bible as day 150 to day 314. And God made a wind to pass over the earth. The waters assuaged. Basically, that means they kind of went back and forth, just like tsunami waves do. Fountains of the deep, windows of heaven were stopped. Rain was restrained, etc. And it goes on. The waters returned from off the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. So they didn't go away right away. It took a long time to go down, but they started to go down at that point. And that's, again, if you look at the secular models, because the ocean crust was being pushed up, making it new and hot. And as it cooled, it started to sink down. So as the ocean crust cools, it kind of drew the water back off the land. And even the secular scientists use this to explain those 6 floods that they believe in. They don't believe in one big flood. They try to say there's 6 different floods spread by millions of years. But to me, this mechanism is an ingenious mechanism to make new crust, spread the continents around, and then bring the water back down off the continents by cooling the earth. So all that new ocean crust is there as a testament to the flood. And so the Tejas, the last sequence, the draining off sequence, is very, very thick from the Gulf. See that big green blob down in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see the volcanoes erupting along Alaska and the Cascades on the west coast. And the mountains pop up at this point. 80% of the world's mountains all pop up at this point. And a lot of that's due to the over-thickening of the crust that took place, and there's something called isostatic rebound, where the over-thick crust has to rise higher because it's got a deeper bottom, almost like a cork. So the thicker the crust is, the more it pushes up. So all these mountains all over the world all form at once, and it helped drain the water off into the Gulf, where we find lots and lots of oil today. And the fossils that we see in those upland areas above the dinosaurs are mostly marine fossils mixed with mammals, which is probably what was living up in places like Canada and a lot of across Brazil, South Africa, south below the Sahara, that area, and we'll see in a minute. So they're mostly looking at those same types of fossil marine. But here's the beginning of the flood. Here's looking at 3 continents. North America, you can see there's a lot more coverage in North America because North America, I believe, is more shallow seas than most continents, so more of it flooded early. It just wasn't very thick. And you see South America, there's very little flooding. This is a combination of all 3 of the first 3 sequences. That's all the flooding there is in South America. And look at Africa. That's all the flooding there is in Africa. Very limited amounts, because these areas, I believe, were higher ground, where humans are probably living more extensively as these continents were still together at the time of the flood. So here's the high point of the flood. We see the same high point with the little dots in North America, that bathtub ring. We see the similar dots across Africa and South America, and the maximum coverage in all 3 of these continents were at the same time. To me, that shows something global was going on. And the maximum thickness across all 3 continents is pretty much the same time, as we'll see. Then there was a receding phase that all happened at the same time. So there's nothing local about this flood. It affected every continent the same. Every continent kind of went up together, every kind of went down together. And the mountains all pop up at the end all over the world. Again, many of these things aren't talked about in secular geology books or in classes because they don't know how to explain them. But it all makes sense in the flood model. Europe, I just finished Europe not too long ago. It's the same pattern. So that first map over there on the left is the first 40 days, the first 3 sequences, only a third of Europe maybe is covered. And you see the maximum coverage in the middle, and you see the receding phase in the far left. And so those same pattern we saw earlier, same, starts out slow, builds to a peak about the same time, and then goes down. So when you look at the surface the volume of all the continents, look at North America, South America, Africa, and Europe, we see they pretty much all start out very, very minimal amounts of volume, the thickness of, pushing a button on a computer, you can total up all the volumes. So computers are great things. You see that they increase to about the same point. And if you add all these up, that African one, the peaks in the brown or the Zuni, supersedes all these other ones. And Europe floods a little bit earlier. You see it's more, that purple line goes up higher. That's because I believe Europe was a lot more wetland area. And you see a lot of dinosaurs across Europe. So you have a lot more, not so much like North America, shallow seas, but you have that lowland area. But you don't have much high ground in Europe. If you add it all up, you can see the total on the far right side mimics exactly what we see here. Here's the world totals based on rock type. So the yellow is sand, the brown is shale, blue is limestones and carbonates, pink is salt, and there's a lot of salt that came out late at different points in the flood as well. But the red is very important at the bottom. That's volcanic rocks. You see the volcanic rocks peak at the end, and that's very, very important to bring on the ice age. The subduction zone volcanoes produce magmas that are very explosive, more granitic-like, and they produce the explosive volcanoes like Mount St. Helens. And those volcanoes erupting all over the world at the same time, late in the flood, can cool the earth enough to help bring on the ice age. And that's why we believe there was an ice age at the end. The ice age is very, very important because they had to lower sea level after the flood was over to open up land bridges to allow animals and humans to walk across from Siberia to Alaska. Because if you had in one location in the world, God had to have a plan to get everything back to these separated continents. And he allowed the animals and humans to migrate for maybe 500 years while the ice age was raging on. Even though it didn't affect the Middle East, it was still to the north of there was still a lot of ice. And that collective amount of ice, which we still see remnants of in Antarctica today, in Greenland today, that lowered sea level enough that animals and humans are able to walk from continent to continent. So here's my sea level curve I drew based on the data. If you look at this map, the Sauk-Kaskaskia, this chart, you can see that you just turn it sideways and you get this sea level curve. So the beginning of the rocks really support a very minimal flooding early, and a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more until they all peak pretty much at the Zuni, and then the Tejas sequences. A long period of time is 150 days or more. The first 150, and I kind of squeeze it all in there because we use kind of this. There's no real scale on that, but that's basically what the flood shows. So here's my pre-flood world map from the continents I have done. We had to kind of guesstimate the others. And this is what we portrayed on that globe when you came to the Discovery Center in October, if you did get there. Where the world's shallow seas were, where the deep seas were, where the lowlands were, the uplands. So humans and mammals probably lived in the light green areas mostly, and then the dinosaurs lived in the dark green areas. And they probably didn't mix too much because, who'd want to live with velociraptors and T-Rexes? And so it looks like that's why the rocks are very distinct fossil layers as you go upward. You see distinct differences, all marine early, and the swampy areas, and then the more upland animals come last, and that's where the humans would have been found. So we look at the Discovery Center globe. When we go through this, we can look at day one, and this is the fountains going off. You can see those white lines are supposed to be like smoke and steam coming up with these fountains bursting. North America is kind of right in the middle there. You can see the Dinosaur Peninsula coming down, and a little bit South America, Africa, and Antarctica are all still together at this point. So at day one, you start to open up these cracks all over the earth, and you start to subduct things. By day 25, you're moving tsunami waves across the shallow seas, muddying up the water a little bit. And by day 40, you're starting to flood the land. So Dinosaur Peninsula is starting to get flooded. The dinosaurs are running in herds. They found 10,000 Maiasaura dinosaurs in Montana, all running and running and running, stampeding away. They left all the little ones behind. They're all adults. They all ran their juveniles and baby dinosaurs, which is a mystery to people like Jack Horner. He can't explain why they're all adults. But if you have a stampede and herd, they're going to outrun the little ones are going to get left behind. And unfortunately, you can't see the continents moving underwater here. There's a lot of rapid plate movement taking place. Moved to day 130, you moved along, now there's just little remnants left. And at this point, the humans that didn't get on the ark were probably desperate and fighting for that last little bit of land. And they knew the water just kept coming and coming and coming. There was nowhere to go. And eventually, day 150, this is what the world looked like. The Bible tells us clearly that by day 150, the world was covered. All the high hills were gone. Anybody that wasn't on the ark, it was drowned or buried in sediment. And a lot of the humans probably didn't get buried deep enough to become fossils because they were the last to be succumb to the waves. But the waves are so fast and so big, even little rafts couldn't survive the waves. Tsunami waves are very, very quick. They move 500 miles an hour across the open ocean. On land, they're probably still moving 40, 50 miles an hour. And so eventually, though, the ocean basin started to sink and cool, and the plates stopped moving, and the mountain ranges pop up first, maybe day 215. By day 314, the world was pretty much in place and dry. And then they waited on the ark for another 60 days or so for the land to green up a little bit because there was no vegetation until grasses and things started to grow. So then God opened up the door and said, you can get off the ark. So the flood itself, staying on the ark was 371 days based on the timing of the Bible. So the flood was global. Everything happened. Every continent does the same thing at about the same time. They all start slow, build to the same peak in about the Zuni, and then they all go down. To me, it's undeniable evidence of a global flood. And that's what I try to put in my book. You'll see with a lot of the maps in there from each of the continents that I looked at. But it was also catastrophic. We'll run through this a little quicker because some of you are falling asleep. And we'll look at a recent flood as well. When I dug dinosaurs in Wyoming, you always find dinosaurs in bone beds mixed together with all these tore apart dinosaur bones. Thousands of bones from different animals. Rarely do you find a complete specimen. It's all just busted up bones and individual bones from different species all mixed together. We see a lot of land and marine common, like we showed down here. This is from the Eocene Green River. You see land plants and fish eating fish. Things are buried perfectly because they're buried so quickly. And recently, about a whole year ago now, in Japan, they found a duck-billed dinosaur out in the ocean, in ocean sediments. Again, that mixing I was talking about. They even found a Plateosaurus dinosaur, like a small sauropod bone, out in a oil well core, which I think I talk about in my dinosaur book, 70 miles offshore Norway. They pulled an oil well core up, and there was an identifiable dinosaur foot bone in it. So dinosaurs were washed, not only marine animals were washed onshore, but dinosaurs were washed offshore. And that's where a lot of humans probably got washed offshore as well at the end of the flood. But there was all this mixing going on, exactly what we expect to find. They even found about a year ago, they announced that we wrote an article about this, an ammonoid. Same thing you find all over Texas, these round ammonoid shells that you kind of see in this picture, cephalopods in amber. So how do you get a marine fossil in tree sap if there wasn't mixing going on? Very difficult to explain some of these things. They don't talk about a lot of that. Here you see the immediate death positions, fish eating fish. They didn't choke and die. They were buried eating their last meal. Dinosaurs are buried rapidly as well. All fossils have to be buried rapidly and deep. And so they got to be deep enough to preserve the bones from decay. And we're seeing now even more soft tissue. These are my favorite ones, the fighting dinosaurs. They found in Mongolia, the white ones over there on the left. It's a velociraptor, which really only had a skull about this big. Wasn't really that big. Steven Spielberg used a velociraptor name on Deinonychus, which is a completely different type of raptor. That's the one you see in our garden view when you walk in. That's a Deinonychus, not a velociraptor. The velociraptor is very small. And it's a protoceratops, and the protoceratops has the mouth, in its mouth has the arm of the velociraptor. It's about to bite down. So it's about to take a bite out of that, and then they were buried instantly. So they were like doing their WWE thing, and all of a sudden buried instantly in the ring. Preserved until they found them in 1990s, I forget what year, by a Polish expedition in Mongolia. And you find dinosaurs like this Hadrosaur, looks like a dead horse, buried instantly. Very, very quick burial, preserving even the skin imprints on the animal. So dinosaurs and all fossils are found in bone beds. They're instant burial, lack of erosion between the layers. That's another matter we could talk more about. So the flood was truly catastrophic. There was nothing tranquil about it. It was global, it was catastrophic. Third, I want to talk about was recent. This is our last point. This is very, very important. I think in the last 150 years, this is some of the most exciting discoveries in paleontology, since the discovery of dinosaurs themselves, is that inside the bones, they're finding original dinosaur cells, dinosaur proteins, dinosaur blood vessels, still flexible. And they test them over and over. These are the original things. And so it started in 2005, but then they've gone back and looked at some of the older literature. They realized they've been finding this stuff since the 60s, way back when I was young. Just like 100 years ago for you guys. They've been finding this stuff for years. They just didn't really report about it until Mary Schweitzer dissolved away part of a T-Rex femur inside. She cracked it open, dissolved away too much bone and some acid, and she saw the soft stuff that's flexible like a rubber band. She could stretch it and snap back. And she tested it and found that's the original dinosaur cells, the original dinosaur proteins. And the physical chemist, here's again some pictures of what looks like red blood cells, even in the dinosaur blood vessels, is the physical chemists have shown that even the most durable proteins like collagen can't last even 1 million years, not even 1 million years. That's the stuff that makes up leather, makes up most of our skin, very durable proteins. Those last longer than most proteins. But that can't even be 1 million years old, and yet the dinosaurs are supposed to be 68 million years old, or 70 or 150 million years old. They've even found worms that are still soft and flexible that are supposed to be 500 million years old. And our question is, how can that be when these things can't last that long? There's no way to preserve them for that. So to me, this is concrete evidence. I won't say proof, but concrete evidence that these animals and these fossils are not that old. They're only thousands of years old at the oldest. But you might say, but we have so few soft tissues. So there's been about 100 papers now that have come out since 2005 showing the original blood vessels that are still flexible, red blood cell-like things. They don't want to admit they're red blood cells yet, but they sure look like red blood cells because they still have the nucleus in. The reptile blood cells still have the nucleus in. That's what we see in these pictures. So all these 100 secular papers out there, but you might say, well, we have so few. But imagine you have to fill a barrel, like a barrel of oil. Well, what we have is billions of barrels of oil all over the world. And in Texas, you guys have the biggest oil fields in the country, in West Texas, in the Permian Basin. The more we frack, the more we find oil. And if these oils are really millions of years old, they should be fracking into these source rocks and getting no oil. They should have all been produced by now. But the other problem with oil is organic. It's mostly from marine algae that was buried in the flood very rapidly. And it's slowly cooked out by the heat of the earth. And if it's over thousands of years old, it will be gone. It doesn't stick around. Organic compounds decompose. They don't last millions of years. When I worked for Chevron, they used to tell us the oil in Wyoming is 150 million years old. It's just waiting for us to find. But when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. Oil breaks down. At the surface, it breaks down. When we spill it, the oil spill in the BP head of the Gulf 8-10 years ago now, most of that has decayed away. And underground, it decays away. And most oil we produce is decayed partially. So we're looking at all this biodegraded material that can't be millions of years old. Dinosaurs can't be millions of years old. Oil can't be millions of years old. All these signs point to a young Earth and a young recent flood, just like the Bible talks about. So today, hopefully, I made an impression upon you that the flood was real. It was a global flood. All the continents do the same thing at the same time. They go up together, they go down together. It was catastrophic. All the fossil evidence shows these things are buried catastrophically. There's no tranquil flood about it. And third, the flood was not millions of years ago, or even billions of years ago. The flood was recent. It was a recent global flood of catastrophic nature. It's a judgment that God sent on the earth. And you can read it in your Bible. You can see it in the rocks. And again, here's the new book that just came out of late last month, just before this quarantine went on. It came out, but you can still order it. We're still mailing books out. But you want to look at the one your teacher has when you get back to classes eventually. Next fall, maybe? That's the plan, we hope. Anyway, this book has those 3 continents in there I talked about in great detail, and a lot of other things, the soft tissue stuff, all that's all in this book. I tried to put everything I could put in this book without getting too carried away. And it was longer than I thought because they made big print. Well, it wasn't that big. they didn't do very small print, but they made it very pretty, and it's a really well illustrated book. They do a really good job. So it ends up being almost 500 pages long. You can read the first 6 chapters or intro things, which your teacher has taught you everything already in that, so you can just skip to the meat of it if you want to. And but it's a pretty good resource if you get a chance to get one. And those videos I showed you, I think you guys, your teachers already are showing you this. Those 4-part dinosaur DVD we put out a few years ago. And in the 4th video on this one is all about the original dinosaur tissues. But where I took most of the pictures, my wife said, "You need this one, this one, this one." Showed the dinosaur swimming. Came from the 3rd one. So it's a really good DVD set if you don't have it. And then this is a book that I usually make my college students over at the King's University in South Lake supplement their secondary text with. So if you're going off to college soon, you want to bring a copy of this with you. It's a $10 book, or it's an ebook is even cheaper than that. Creation Basics and Beyond. I didn't write any of this. They printed this first edition of this just before I showed up at ICR 7 years ago. And we're working on an update to kind of make sure that we show a little bit more of the research I've done. But this talks about the dinosaur soft tissues. It talks about the evidence that the universe is young, from comets and spiral galaxies and all these things. It covers a little bit of everything. And it's only, even if you buy the paperback, it's $10. So it's a really good resource to take with you to get through secular colleges and even many Christian colleges that don't teach the literal, flood was recent and global. And again, most Christian colleges today don't. And so this is something to kind of keep you thinking that there's another story they're not telling me. And they don't want you to necessarily believe that God's word is 100% true, but it really is. And that's what this book shows, and all my research has been showing.